And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Okay, this is the current location of the next big storm coming up that'll be bringing the gale force winds and rain into Kodiak Island tonight and pushing up toward the North Gulf Coast late tonight and into the Panhandle. We'll see for tomorrow afternoon, that low center moves right up on the east side of Kodiak Island, or close to the island there, and that strong front bringing gale force winds, storm force winds here over toward the western or northwest part of the Gulf of Alaska. Also wind and rain pushing into the Panhandle, increasing rain across southern Alaska, dry and mostly sunny to the north. And then that storm really weakens down to up to 1,009 millibars now. And the gradient, nothing like what will be tomorrow or tonight and tomorrow afternoon. So quite a bit of weakening, much lighter winds. Still an area of showers and rain across southern Alaska, the North Gulf Coast, and showers on the decrease over the Panhandle. For Saturday, south winds 30 knots on the south coast and the central coast. We've got south winds at 25 knots. And then gale warnings on the north coast, south to southeast winds 30 to 40 knots, and southeast 20 with gusts of 40 Lynn Canal, southeast 25 with gusts of 40 knots there for Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait. Small craft advisory, south winds 30 knots, seas 11 feet. And for the day on Sunday, lighter winds there for Clarence Strait. South at 15, seas 4 feet. South winds 20 knots for Stevens Passage with 4-foot seas. And Lynn Canal, southeast winds 25 knots. Still gusting up around 40 knots, though, for some reason. And west winds at 15 knots there for the south coast. Central coast, southwest winds at 20 knots. And the north coast, kind of a southwest to southeast wind condition there at 20 to 25 knots. Prince William Sound, gale warnings tomorrow, northeast winds 35 knots, seas up to 6 feet, and the North Gulf Coast, east-northeast winds at 45 knots with 15-foot seas. Barren Islands, northeast at 45 knots there. Kamishak Bay, good gales in there as well from the northeast at 40 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, northeast winds 35 knots, seas up to 12 feet. Small craft advisories, Northern Cook Inlet for north winds at 25. And for Sunday, Cook Inlet, north to northwest breeze now at about 10 knots with 3-foot seas. Southwesterlies at 15 for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. Winds lighter on the North Gulf Coast as well. West side here about 15 knots from the south, 20 to 25 knots on the east side. And southeast at 15 for Prince William Sound with seas coming down to 3 feet. Kodiak Island tomorrow, good gales, northeast 40 knots, seas up to 16 feet. Alaska Peninsula, northwest 15 to 20 knots. And Bristol Bay, small craft advisories for north winds at 30 knots with 6-foot seas. Kodiak Island on Sunday, looking at southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And the Alaska Peninsula, southwesterlies 15 to 25 knots. And small craft advisories for Bristol Bay for southwest winds at 25. Eastern Aleutians for Unalaska Island, west-northwest at 20 knots. Otherwise, from Unimak Island out to Adak, light variable winds tomorrow at 10 knots. And not too bad wind-wise out west, west to north winds at 15 to 20 knots. And for Sunday, western Aleutians, north to northwest winds, 15 knots. Light variable winds continue here for the central and eastern Aleutians. Variable 10 knots from Adak to Unalaska Island. And for the southwest coast tomorrow, north to northwest winds at about 20 knots. North 20 for St. Matthew Island, as well as St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, all north of 20. North 15 for the Pribilofs. And for Sunday, southwest 15 for the Pribilofs, turn southerly for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast at 15 knots. Yukon Delta Coast, north winds 15 knots, same thing for St. Matthew Island. And northeast winds 15 knots for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. Eastern Beaufort Sea Coast, north winds 5 knots tomorrow, seas 1 feet. Central Coast, north at 10. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast for northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Chukchi Sea, north to northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots. And for the day Sunday, Chukchi Sea, small craft advisories continue. Northeast winds, north to northeast, 25 knots, 25 to 30 knots. Western Arctic coast, east at 20, 15 knots out of these for the central coast, northeast 15 for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast.